Record. Hello and welcome to another episode of We Love PMO. I'm your host, Sarah, and today we have a fantastic guest who brings deep expertise in navigating high-stake projects in the public sector. And as someone who has spent years leading portfolios and overseeing complex projects myself, I know the unique challenges that come with working environments that are full of political pressures, high visibility, and quite often limited safety nets. And these real world experiences fuel my passion for this podcast. And today we're going to be diving into a similar conversation with our guest, who has spent over 15 years overseeing public sector projects and now coaches senior leaders on delivering results in tough environments. So I'd like to introduce our guest today, Matthew, who's the founder of the Risk Insider. He has a wealth of experience in project in the public sector and is now guiding leaders on how to successfully manage those under pressure. So welcome to the show, Matthew. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. And before we sort of dive in deeper to some topics, could you start by telling us a bit about your journey into public project oversight and what inspired you to transition into the coaching space?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first half of my career was largely international through the UK and Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, as well as a quick spot in South Korea. Um, many different public agencies across those different countries, as well as a lot of private sector experience, mostly within project management and client services. When I finally arrived in Ottawa, Canada's capital, of course, government is the biggest game in town in that city, and so I found myself working in government, and what I was doing was helping to develop a professional development plan and learning products for the internal audit community there. And to be perfectly honest, I really had no idea what internal audit was. I didn't know anything about the term audit beyond doing some number crunching with those green eye shades and under sweaty light bulbs and that kind of thing. So um, it was a new experience for me. However, after doing that for between a year or so, year or two, it opened up some possibilities, and I decided to explore that. And so I did get into some internal audit. I spent a lot of the next number of years in there, as well as within project oversight functions for large, major transformational projects throughout the government. Now, what I discovered over those many years was um, how difficult it seemed to be to have conversations between oversight functions and project leads about risks and risk management. One side of the fence, of course, thought it was the most important thing in the world and used lots of nomenclature and templates and tools and all of these standalone strategies. And the other side of the fence, the project delivery side, saw it as a compliance activity and let's just fill out the forms and move on and get to the real work. And having lived both sides, both experiences, um, it didn't jive for me because the way I always understood it was that a risk is just something that gets in the way of your objectives. Full stop. It's not some complicated theory. It's not something that should be treated on a parallel track. It is fundamental to delivering the objectives. And that's the way that I tried to approach it. And so what I found myself more and more was trying to act as that translator for a lot of these type of oversight activities. And the more that I got engaged in these major, larger projects, the more that I saw that filtered all the way up to the top. And so as I rose through the ranks, became executive and finally senior executive in the federal banking and insurance regulator, I found that the conversations that I'd encountered in the early days were still happening. And so when I eventually left the public service, that to me spoke to a big need. Wasn't about coaching audit or coaching project managers, as there are lots of those, but really trying to bridge that gap between managing the project risks, which again, I'll just say is coded for trying to manage towards project objectives. And that's what I do now is coaching senior public leaders on those major transformational projects, trying to keep them in check. And I'm sure we'll get into this in a little while as well, that being aware of the risks is not um, diminishing, reducing, or nullifying the ambition of the project. And that's really a big pain point for a lot of conversations that I get into. Risk management is really there to support the ambition, to keep going for those moonshots, but just make sure that we've mapped it out along the way and we're ready for what's coming next.
Absolutely. And you're sort of it's sort of talking about situations I've been in many times where kind of risk management, ideally should be looked as a bit like a golden thread for everything that you're doing, but it shouldn't be a hindrance. And I think what you've
Absolutely.
mentioned there about the objectives, and that's a really key point. And when I do a lot of training from sort of like a RAID sort of perspective, I will always draw them back to the objectives because quite often what happens is people get so tied up in trying to identify the risk, getting themselves confused between what's a risk and what's an issue and how do we score it, that they start to chuck out all these ideas of risks and they have this huge list and you're like, do any of them actually link to the project objectives? If
Mhm.
these occur, is it going to stop it? And it's like, no. And it's like, well, we don't need to know about them.
Yeah.
Park them to the side unless it's going to be a corporate level risk which you thought of that we can have a conversation from a corporate perspective, but from a project perspective, what is going to have an impact on your objectives? And when that sort of lands and a penny drops, it's just like, oh, that's brilliant. Like they then like they get it a bit more. And I think a lot of them as well kind of get really hung up on the cause and the effect and the impact and sort of understanding the difference between, what is a cause, what's the impact, and what's the
hmm
event. And that kind of ties people up a lot as well.
hmm
Um, so definitely if we can use sort of meta language, that's something, to try and have that standardized approach is really, really helpful to have for people. But yeah, it sounds like you've probably had very similar sort of conversations with project managers and senior leaders in the past. Um,
Absolutely.
so you've spent a long time working in the public sector, and what are your sort of what do you see as like the unique challenges that leaders face when they're working on those sort of high stake projects in that public sector space?
I'd say, I mean, there are myriad complications that can enter into any project, especially within the public sector. I think the two largest recurring ones that make it extremely difficult and it makes it feel like it's impossible to deliver sometimes. The two major ones would be systemically, so structurally, and then culturally, and they do feed upon each other. So within the structure, the larger the project, the more stakeholders that are going to be involved, the more oversight that's going to be involved, the more just generally speaking, stakeholders that have a say in, this, that, or the other. And so what that does is that tends to spread around a lot of accountability. And very often the project manager is, nominally the manager, but there are so many decisions that have to take place outside of his or hers domains. And so as a result, there's a little bit, I don't want to say hands washing, but there's comfort in numbers that something has been taken care of, and that if the oversight or the steering committee agrees to it, then it's a done deal, and basically we're okay. But it seems to be, and this is where the culture feeds it, is there seems to be a little bit of a retreat into foxholes versus trying to go dive into the breach to continue with a military term. So what happens is a lot of folks are discussing it. A lot of folks are at the table. No one necessarily owns it, and it can be anything here. It can be from a project element all the way up to the project itself. And so as a result, everybody's comfortable that it's being taken care of, but nobody can confidently point to any one person or body and say, this is the person who's really taking charge of it. And that seems like an exaggeration, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will come up with a counter argument to that, to say, well, the job title says it, the project charter says it, something, 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 and those are all true, except we can see in the public sector again, the larger it is, um, just how many voices are really behind a single signature. And the meeting minutes will just show full agreement with something versus this person is accountable for delivering X by Y date, and these will be the consequences if they don't happen.
Yes, that
Uh,
accountability is key, isn't it? And sometimes,
it
like you said,
is.
particularly when that organization is a lot larger, it's really difficult to sort of pin down who that is. Um, and it's always easy to then sort of place the blame, on the cogs kind of lower down
Mhm.
in regards to that sort of failure if the project is to fail, which is not the not the way for it to go at all. But also, I find if you're in a particularly like in the health sector, for example, in the UK, there's a lot of like sometimes political changes that are happening in regards to the
Mhm.
government and stuff. So the scope of the project can change very quickly, where you have your senior executives or your CEO or your chief finance officer who will make a decision on the project, which completely changes the deliverables and stuff and impacts the risks that are there. Um, and they'll make that agreement, but they don't necessarily have the accountability of
Yeah.
like the products that are being developed or the service that's being tweaked. Um, so yeah, I think sometimes that kind of it's difficult to define down that single person. Um, if they can do it, that's helpful. And I find quite often a lot of organizations who have a sort of lower maturity in regards to their project management frameworks or if they have a PMO in place, is the definition of the roles and accountabilities of a project exec and the project sponsor, and
Mhm.
actually what is the difference between the two? What are they accountable for, and what does their role do? And I've seen that time and time again where the project manager is trying to find a way forward where there's blockers that are coming up, and they'll go to their project executive to help for that steering or guidance. But
Mhm.
actually, they are by name a project executive, but actually they don't really know too much about the project itself
Absolutely.
or how the governance is working, or particular organizations that have external parties and partners that work with each other. And it's like, oh, they're an expert in fire engineering, they'll be a great project executive, but actually have no understanding of the frameworks or governance processes and stuff like that. Um, and that comes up time and time again, where does that accountability go when they're trying to
Mhm.
escalate it upwards?
Yeah, so I'd go even further to just say not only do they, rarely know much of the details of the projects, but they don't want to. And it's not because they're bad people, they're evil or anything else. It's just very often the project sponsors are, they're voluntold, as the expression goes,
Yeah,
right? So they're already working very, very long hours. They've got goodness knows how many things on their plate already. And the head of the organization says, okay, you have to act in this capacity. And so it's just one more thing. So the more they can get away with, the better. And to be perfectly frank, very often, well, so first of all, you mentioned, changing political leadership. I'd say the leadership of the projects change extremely frequently as well within the public sector,
absolutely.
because
Yeah.
they are such huge projects, and people are looking after their own careers and they want a promotion or whatever the case may be. So they're shuffling around as well, and the huge, again, systemic versus cultural interplay there is that a lot of the senior leaders won't be there for the victory parade, but they'll be there for the mistakes along the way. So this feeds that risk aversion culture where they just want to make sure that, again, they're in that foxhole, things are covered, and their name isn't going to appear anywhere in the newspapers. And so one of the things that I like to counsel is that that problem just isn't going away. It is a structural one. If you're talking, I'm not sure offhand the size of the UK public service, though the public service in Canada is approaching 300,000 people. In the United States, it's about 2 million people. And again, constantly changing senior leadership. So that culture is not going to be changed from a project manager. Just full stop. It's not going to be. Um, What we can do is change our perspective rather than placing the faith in the oversight, rather than placing the faith in the absolute top leadership. We just acknowledge that we have the requirements that will be assigned to us from those parties. But really, we have to focus our work, downwards and across. We have to ensure that we know that we are accountable for the elements for which we're accountable. We have to work with our partners. So if there are stakeholders that are co-delivering, ideally there aren't. Ideally there is one true project manager and the other folks are feeding in, but the accountability lines are still there. In the public sector, that's not very common, but that would be great. Um, but really focusing downwards and taking that ownership, because once we start to place the faith in the machinery of the project, the public sector project oversight system, we've really ceded control and we've acknowledged that the accountability just will not be placed where it should be. And I do think that that is a reason why so many projects are set up for failure within the public sector. And that simple mindset shift, um, it sounds transactional, but it's actually transformational, and it can make a big difference between those projects that eke out a victory despite the systemic and cultural issues, versus those that are just swallowed up kind of into the ether and become one more headline.
So you've in our sort of discussion when we were talking about sort of risk management, you sort of mentioned about risk aversion and then obviously about delivering results. So how do you see them sort of balancing these opposing forces, especially when there is that pressure at play, whether that is kind of political or funding? How do you sort of how do you see is best to do that?
Um, excuse me. So I do think that a lot of the risk aversion just comes from the natural knee-jerk reaction for sure, but a lot of it does come from um, the fear of the unknown, hypothetical versus practical. And one of the things that a lot of project managers can do if they are trying to stretch the boundaries of what either previous project managers or other public servants have tried to accomplish, it's getting ahead of that, coming up with a tangible response. So often within risk management, there might be a risk. We might not attract the right people. I mean, that risk just seems to be in terms of the team, the project composition. That just seems to be a generic risk that has been placed in every single project risk assessment that I've ever seen. Shortage of talent or staff turnover or something like that. And the mitigation, quote unquote, strategy that I've seen, I don't know how many times, is, we'll monitor closely or we'll hire the right people or something like that, which doesn't mean anything at all. And so rather than taking theoretical stabs at something generic and the eyes just glaze over, if we're setting something bold, say this is exactly how we are going to tackle it. This is what we expect it will look like, and this is how we would attack it under the circumstances. And sometimes that's not even necessarily a risk. Sometimes we apply that risk mindset or mindset rather, to the objectives themselves. So we say we want to deliver a bridge that's 100 kilometers long, and we know that the reaction is going to be, well, there's no way we're going to get the money, or there's no way that the engineering would support it, or there's no way we're going to get the public's consent, or, a whole litany of possible challenges. And what those challenges are, they're risks, right? And some of them are extremely legitimate and they would make sense. But if that leadership team truly believes that it can be accomplished, let's brainstorm before we go talking about funding or oversight or any of these types of enabling infrastructure that we require. Um, let's hash it out as a team. Let's think of every possible objection that can be summoned by every inquiring mind and come up with that action plan. So it's almost as if we're treating objections as risks, which they are, and we're coming up with something concrete. And so that for every objection we receive, we can say, yes, valid concern. I understand where you're coming from. We've thought about it, and this is how we're going to tackle that issue. So it's trying to get ahead of those issues before they even rise. And when I say issues in this case, of course, it is dissenting opinion.
I think sometimes they're so eager to get to the delivery of the project
Hmm.
that the planning stage, which to me is the most important, that's the key bit where, even before you had that kickoff, making sure that everyone actually understands what it is we're trying to achieve. And in that, either in that kickoff meeting or before that, with all the stakeholders, actually do a bit of, post-mortem analysis to help you from a risk perspective. So, okay, if the worst should happen, and we'll work backwards, what are some of those risks that could potentially sort of come up, particularly when
Absolutely.
they're sort of throwing out those generic ones that everyone's going to do. So you usually say, look, here's a taxonomy for that. Here's your generic ones. We don't need to talk about them. We've got that list ready to go. But actually the ones that are, more sort of specific to this project itself. And another one that I like to do to try and get people to think outside the box is the Johari window, which I know people use in regards to their sort of personality, but actually using it from a risk perspective. And that really throws up some very interesting sort of conversations, and quite often risks come up that they hadn't even thought of. And I think making sure those mitigations, like you said, aren't just very, yeah, we'll review that in 6 months, or yeah, we'll just have a monthly catch up. They're just,
Hmm.
they're not tangible. They need to be something really, it needs to be an action, something you're going to take away and you're
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
action that to make sure that this doesn't occur. Um,
Yeah, and I mean, as you mentioned earlier, that sometimes the we assemble this risk register of a thousand different possible risks, and we're not even sure whether or not they apply. Um, One of the filters that I like to apply is, are you vested in attacking this? And if the team isn't, then you really have to question, is it tied to the objectives? And this is again where a little bit of the machinery starts to lead the project team astray, is that it becomes a knee-jerk reaction of uh, the whole public service infrastructure to point towards that corporate risk team, that enterprise risk team. And so then we do get those corporate risks that very, very regularly do not apply to the project. The project is a one-off, it's a special purpose. They're trying to achieve something that, yes, will help reinforce the service or whatever it is that the ministry is trying to apply or to effect. But it has its own unique challenges. And what we try to do is say, well, this one's kind of tied to that corporate risk, so let's put it down. And so immediately we've compromised our own definition of what that risk is. And then because we've done that, a week later we look at it and we're, half in agreement with what it is. And so as a result, we come up with a mitigation strategy that's, half as effective as it could have been at best. And then of course we can't really monitor it because we're not even really sure what we were monitoring to begin with.
Yes, I see that time and time again as well. And what you sort of said is, I think risk appetite, actually agreeing. So the organization agreeing what is their appetite for risk? What are
Hmm.
they willing to take the risks on? And also who's going to own those risks? So we've
Hmm.
identified them, we've got the mitigating actions, but who's actually going to go and do these things?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
which quite
absolutely.
often that gets forgotten, which is such an easy thing to do while you're around the
Yeah.
table. And yeah.
Oh, so often that I've seen on these risk plans, again, they're corporate risks that don't identify with the project, and then a sector is accountable for the risk. And so, okay, well, which one of the 150 people should I call if
Yeah.
there's a problem? And of course, it becomes that well, the Abbott Costello who's on first, and we're just not going to get anywhere with it.
And with your work with sort of coaching at that sort of senior leader level, what is one of the sort of common mistakes that you see them make when they are sort of part of leading a project, and how do you help them overcome that?
It's partly what I alluded to before about that mindset of preparing for all of the other cogs in the machine as, I don't want to say restrictors or hinderers, but external parties that we will not get as much out of those conversations as they will get out of the project. Now, that's not to say that it can't take place, but we have to flip that relationship. there is a feed the beast type of mentality that
Mm.
in so many of these projects where we're churning out lots of reports and we're trying to make sure that they get everything they need, and very often they're not entirely sure what they need apart from this was the last project, so we're going to use the same template. So so sometimes that's okay, and we can just feed that beast as is needed if it's not going to drain too many resources. But what we need to start thinking about as well is what can I get out of that oversight committee? Because they're all senior people. They've seen a lot, and unfortunately, even at that level, people who have accomplished a lot and they're at the oversight or the steering committee table because they've accomplished a lot, but they fall into that same machinery type of role. So they're asking the same questions, they have the same expectations, and it's up to us to kind of nudge them outside of that. Well, I might even say kind of kick them outside of that role to give them a bit of a shake, so that if we're talking about risk, for example, they've seen a lot. And so let's stop talking about corporate risks. Let's stop talking about what the template demands. Um, how many of you around the table have, encountered a project like this? Um, if we were trying to implement this, has anyone seen this type of thing go wrong, or has anybody seen it go right? Start treating it as almost as interviews, to draw from the information rather than just push it upwards. Because as a project manager, chances are the only thing we will get by that upwards direction type of relationship is diminishing of activities, diminishing of ambition, because it does fall into that risk aversion mindset. That culture will win every single time. Once we try to kick the whole conversation out of that rut, we flip it around. We try to use the expertise. Then we've changed that dynamic, and hopefully we've extended our project culture a little bit outwards, potentially into the steering committee, and we can start having meaningful conversations. And so yes, we can still do the reports if needed, but then once we start to build that credibility as well, then we can start to challenge. Does this report really tell you everything you need? What are your concerns? How can we address your concerns? And start to make that a real conversation, again, and getting out of that nomenclature and process driven type of conversation.
Absolutely. I think that really helps build the buy-in from them as well. So they're invested in it. Actually, they're seeing the
Absolutely.
benefits. And I think it's really important to have these conversations where we're using the corporate memory, but we're also using their lived experience, which you can then pair up with the lessons learned. So, sometimes there may have been 20 other projects in the past, but they just get forgot about. They don't get talked about again.
Oh,
But it's like,
yes.
hang on, there's lessons there. There's things that work really well, the successes that we can replicate, but also the bits where it went wrong. Well, why did it go wrong? Let's go and talk to those people so then we don't make the same mistake again. And
So,
I think,
and
yeah,
anybody who's ever worked with me knows the project lessons learned are the bane of my existence, because I am such a big believer in lessons learned, but so often they're just lessons observed. And so they'll write them down, they'll file them in the right place, and then they will be forgotten forever. And it could be 6 months later, in a very similar type of project, and everybody's basically starting from scratch. So I
reinventing the
complete
wheel and
exactly. I completely agree with
it
you.
should be
And
a
this is,
live repository where you've got a contact name or department that you can link in with, have those conversations right at the start as you're starting to do your
yeah.
scoping.
And one
Um,
thing I did, when I was running a program was, we would run through, say 10 to 20 similar type of projects per year. And we insisted on having lessons learned after every phase because we forget, right? If something lasts a year or something, we forget. We assign just as much weight to the good things that happen as the bad things. But anyways, they go through a repository, and then twice a year, someone is tasked with going through all of those lessons learned, extracting them, establishing themes, and those feed the annual team improvement plans. And what can we do moving forward? We've seen that 3 or 4 projects have encountered this issue. How do we fix it? And that becomes, and again, then we assign it to team members, so everybody's feeling empowered. Everybody feels like they're building something, they're improving something, And most importantly, I'm happy because we're not forgetting those lessons learned.
Absolutely. And it's just knocking those walls down of that silo sort of mentality of working,
Yep.
and just, yeah, getting that communication sort of flowing.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the most sort of difficult aspects of public sector projects is that failure sometimes can fade into silence rather than being acknowledged, just like as we were just talking about. So how
Mhm.
do you approach risk management in environments where accountability is blurred or minimized?
Well, I mean, as we've already talked about, it will be blurred and minimized. It's just an accepted fact. So, um, what the senior leaders, uh, what I always recommend senior leaders do is again try to get away from the risk conversation to begin with. That word has just becomes a trap. It just leads us down this parallel compliancy type of activity. So again, what are the objectives and what can go wrong? What will block us? Where are we trying to go, and what will prevent us from getting there? And have those types of conversations, um, and then trying to own as many of them as possible. Um, Accountability of objectives is no more, no less important than accountability of risk management. So my preference is always how many can we get within our control? How many can we get with at least a strong influence? And how can we simplify these types of conversations or even structures? Um, we do often get into a trap of it's huge project, so it has to involve tons of people. And again, everybody's busy, everybody's overworked, so it's going to be delegated, split up between team members. And within a few weeks, we don't even know who's doing what. Maybe we do within our own project, but not within the stakeholders, and there are always stakeholders within public sector projects. So it's really trying to keep it simple and making sure that you know I'm not a big fan of the well, I say I'm not a big fan of the expression, but I use it far too often. The old expression of just having one throat to choke on any one issue, right? It's yes, it's not a particularly friendly one, but at least it does give the visual of trying to bring that accountability to one person, not a team, and certainly not a sector, as I've seen.
Yes, I've seen that time and time again. Um, so working with the leaders that you kind of work with, what is the most important sort of mindset shift they need to make in order to foster that culture of delivery over sort of risk aversion?
I'd say it's two different things. One is the availability of empowerment there is within the project manager role, whether that's a mid-level manager or whether it's a senior manager, that we do follow. I keep calling it a trap because to me that's what it is. That really, yes, I'm in charge, but we have to make sure that the oversight committee is okay with it or the steering committee. I have to make sure that all of these different people are okay with it. And yes, I mean, let's be honest, they're in a hierarchy. It's not like they can just kind of go rogue and spend $1 billion without anyone else being involved. But having that mindset shift of I own this project, I'm accountable for this project, and this is what I'm going to bring to them, and this is my plan for getting them on board, is very, very different to um, developing a plan that has all of the template requirements. And so one is one of selling the project, selling the ambition, and the second is doing what's required. And while no one would ever consciously just do the absolute minimum, by drawing from the processes, by drawing from the procedures and the infrastructure, that's inevitably where we go. And that feeds the second mindset shift, which is we are, and I would say we as in the public service are capable of far more than that first reaction would allow. And so, no, maybe, we're not going to be able to build, build a bridge from London to Paris or something like that. But thinking about the possibilities, and then, yeah, okay, maybe scaling that back somewhat if it can't be done. But that would be a filtering activity that I would always apply after the fact. So the ambition should not be undercut before we've even taken the first step. And a true understanding of what the true risks are and what we can do about them is how we can preserve that ambition, because we can then um, counterattack the concerns, the the undercutting that could come down the road.
I bring you back on something you sort of said about the minimum, and where my mind was going about is particularly if we're creating a service or particularly a product within a project, is having that minimum viable product, the MVP.
Yes, yes.
Because quite often the stakeholders will start going for the gold quality, all wheel, whistles, bells, I want everything. But actually, is that going to be sustainable? Is that going to be something where we have the funding right now to develop it? But is that something we can sustain in regards to the maintenance of that going forwards? And
Hmm.
you also mentioned about the templates as well, but it's the content that's important, but also um, from a framework perspective, is it proportionate? Do we have,
Hmm.
the process that we're following, is it proportionate to the size and complexity of the project? Is the project transformational? Is it just operational? Is it transactional? Because if it's just transactional, we don't need, a 30-page business case. And in order to do
Hmm.
that, we kind of need just a one-page proposal. And I think sometimes we can make things a lot more difficult for ourselves in certain organizations where it becomes a bit more too bureaucratic, and it
Hmm.
is very much feed the beast and lots of tick boxes, and it never gets looked at, and then people get disheartened and like low morale, and the
Yeah.
areas that are important to focus on kind of get glossed over because we're so tied up in trying to go through all these different sign-off processes, particularly when there's numerous oversight committees that you might have one oversight committee that feeds into a steering group committee, which then feeds
Hmm.
into the SLT, which then
Hmm.
feeds into your trustees, and it's just like an everlasting chain of kind of going upwards to get sign off, where at the end of the day, what's important is that there's accountability and that you're providing assurance that you're doing what you can within your boundaries to make sure that you're delivering at least an MVP at the end of the day.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so there's MVP, there's the minimum viable product, and there's a minimum viable plan. And the plan is, so I'd probably attack that in two different ways. One is there's the minimum viable plan in the way that I talked about a moment ago, in terms of, well, we filled it out, and this is what it looks like it'd be reasonable. But then there's also the notion of, hopefully there's at least some project management expertise on the team. So, get in a room and hash it out as you would like to deliver it, and fill out everything that you need to do. Your objectives and how much money you think you need, and what are some of those risks, and what do you think you'll do? Do all those as a standalone activity, and then work with the templates afterwards, because the templates very often they do take you in that sequential order, and the examples they give are very vanilla. And the Canadian federal government as well, so you got the treasury proposal there, and it's very narrow columns, because there's got to be the English and the French and the same piece of paper. And so as a result, it's impossible to read it without your eyes glazing over. And so you can very well get through a 50-page document and just say, I know it's a project and I have no idea what they want to do. Whereas if you're trying to establish it just within the team, at least communicate, make sure everyone really knows what they want to do, and then translate it, then hopefully the ambition will still stay true to what the team was trying to accomplish in the first place.
Absolutely. And sort of looking ahead, what advice would you give to emerging leaders who aspire to make impact in the public sector, particularly in a project management environment?
The biggest thing I could say is, further to a lot of what we talked about with ambition, is the amount of possibilities is endless within the public service. And that might sound kind of wishy-washy, but the number of times that I was told, um, you can't do that, we can't do that, it's not allowed, the policy doesn't allow it, there isn't a process for that. And I've pushed back or asked somebody else, or built what was needed, um, and it flew just fine. that list is longer than my arm. And so when we talk about having true ambition within the public service, it's not just, something that you put on a poster and hang on your wall to cure your gloomy days. It's very real. Um, and in fact, there are tons of people who are dying to see that ambition. The One of the saddest things I see on a regular basis is really, really bright people who get through their days in the public service because they came in thinking there's a lot we can do for our country, for our communities, and they're very excited about it. And they encountered too many no's, and finally they've just been reduced to that paper pushing role, even though there's so much they're capable of so much more. And so, what I would really, really encourage everyone to do is to say, not just we can do a lot more, but here's all the reasons why I can do a lot more, and bringing that back to, as I always do, bringing it back to that risk conversation again. If we just change the definition and say, um, these are the risks that are going to be highlighted when I propose my solution, and here are all the things that I'm going to do. Doing that first, um, answering all of the questions before they're even asked, and proposing a tactical strategy for how to deliver on that ambition is going to be key.
I think that's really important. Being able to answer, preempt some of those questions that you're going to get asked in there. So, have you thought about this? Yes, I have. And these are the potential solutions and these are the potential issues. It
Yeah.
just really helps with that sort of buy-in and getting people on board, um, and getting people talking about risk in a positive sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, again, one of the things that drew me to speak to public service project leaders versus the other side is, again, trying to shift that mindset and that perspective. And it drew me to, so I developed, and your listeners can grab this for free, is a checklist, as we call it, a health check. 10 very simple risks that apply to many, if not all, public service projects. And they're the ones that we just don't even think about, but they are there. For example, one of them is, does your project factor in changing political leadership? Um, I don't think I've ever seen a project management risk plan that includes that. So it's about identifying what's already right in front of you, but we are avoiding going down that corporate risk trap of trying to just grab generic risks, and populating the template. So again, that health check is available for free to download at the riskinsider.com/health check. And I encourage everyone to check that out.
And what we'll do is I'll drop that into the podcast description as well, so
Perfect. Yeah.
our listeners can grab that. And before I bring it to a close, Matthew, I didn't know if there was anything else. How can people sort of link in with you? Where can they sort of find you, follow you?
Yeah, thank you. Probably the easiest way is just to go to the riskinsider.com/health check, grab that copy, and on there, there are all my contact details. But if you want to set up a conversation or just reach out to me, I do try to answer as many emails as possible. I don't like to just leave them to the machinery or anything else like that. So the riskinsider.com/health check, and you'll get all of my contact information there.
Yeah, and we'll drop that down in the footer as well. So thank you so
Great.
much for joining me today, Matthew. Your insights have been really invaluable, and I know our listeners will walk away with a really deeper understanding of the challenges that they could face if they're working within the public sector. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of We Love PMO. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode. And for more resources and insights, please feel free to head over to our website, www.welovepmo.co.uk. So, yeah, thanks again, Matthew. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.